Normally, if this was a big class, I would say, for those of you who weren't here, but now I can say for the 5 of you that weren't here last week. One of the things that we're doing is we're looking at how, as Westerners, through our Western culture, we tend to read scripture and assume things about it that may not be exactly what the people in the Bible thought about. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we may not be aware of certain situations scripturally or in the Bible, geographically or ethnically, a whole lot of dealing work. Today we're going to talk about gender and sort of sex, celibacy, and food and things like that. And so I just hope that you'll picture the scriptures I'm trying to explain it to you, and that my vision can be your vision. I tend to get all excited about things and I go, oh, this is so cool. And some other people I talk to say, you're weird. Not to mention annoying. And so that's how the class started. I was being called annoying. So long time ago, Nora and I were talking to Beth Sykes, and I don't know, I assume all of you know Beth. And she was asked, they had 3 children. She said, somebody asked them if she would have them, would she do it all over again? And she said, yeah, but I'd have 3 different ones. Now, if you know Beth, she has a real dry wit and she's funny. And so we took that as humor. But you never know. I mean, she may have been as serious can be. There are days when we would say the same thing very seriously also. So let me give you one more example. Because we think we knew that, we took it without being said that she was joking, but we didn't know for sure. Had we lived in her house or talked to Don to see if he could verify that, then it might have been different. I had a thing that happened in my life for a long time. My father was, among other things, an adulterer. He was an alcoholic. He was abusive and mean, and he was not a father. And so, and I'm not the only one who's had situations like that. But as I got into my teenage years, I had a conversation with my mother, and she said, here's why your dad is the way he is. And Nora knows this story, and some of the others may. When he was 12, his parents sent him to the store to buy bread. When he got back to the house, they were gone. Because of the time prior to World War II, they couldn't afford that child. And they just needed to say, good luck, you're smart enough, you'll handle it. Do any of you know what the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps was? Well, he was big enough for his age that he lied about his age and joined the CCC, and actually was out in New Mexico. He told Nora and I, when we took him there one time, that he had done road work and stuff like that out for the CCC when he was a kid. as bad as I thought he was, he didn't send me to the store for bread, so I had to try and readjust some of my thinking and say, how would that, if that happened to me, how would that affect me? How did he learn to be a father when at 12 he was abandoned? And that backstory changed entirely what I knew about him and how I perceived him. Later in life, I found other things that were similar in nature. And so I've had to, as an older adult, rethink what it was that I thought went without saying. It went without saying that he was a bad father. It went without saying, but when you put it all together, it's a different story. And so that's kind of what I'm doing with this class, is looking at things like that and saying, what was really meant. If you will, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I said we were going to talk about sex or celibacy. Now, it's a fairly long chapter.
What chapter again? I'm sorry.
Chapter 7. And I'm going to just point out some things. Most of you, or all of you, I'm sorry. All of you are very smart and you can read while I'm talking. Is that Freudian? I don't know. If you look here, the title generally in your Bibles for this particular chapter is Principles for Marriage. And he said, now concerning the matters about which he wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptations to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And he goes on to talk about the rights of the husband and the wife and how they should relate to each other. Then in verse 6, he says, now, as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. And then he goes on to talk about the different situations. To the unmarried and the widows, he says, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it's better to marry than to burden with passion. And then he goes on to give commands to or suggestions to the married. And if a woman separates from her husband, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. And we pick up on that verse a whole lot. To the rest, I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and so on. And he tells what to do with the unbelievers. Then he goes in verse 17 and starts to talk about, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. And he goes on to talk about, for neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Do not be concerned about it, but if you gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. Now, what are you picking up on here so far? What's one of the key ideas that he's putting forth? If you're married, stay married. if you become single, stay single. If you can't stay single, if you can't stay single. Am I stepping out of it?
No, when you did your thumbs up, it did it on the Zoom too. It gives a thumbs up and when you wave, it says, "Are you raising your hand?" Anyway, sorry, squirrel. Thumbs up.
He goes on to talk about the unmarried and the widowed in the same vein. So he's single. And what is he telling them?
Better to stay single.
I wish, from my
Everybody's
point of view, that it'd be better if you stay single. Now, that's because he is single. And he's saying that. In our Western culture, what do? We gravitate towards starting with Genesis, and we start talking about marriage as the preferred thing in our culture. Celibacy is not something that we push. We read through that whole chapter 7, and we pick up what we want about the celibacy thing, but we don't make it a big deal in the Western culture. What's the key that he's talking about? What do you think?
Seems to me like he's just saying stay in the position you're in.
Why?
It says you should remain in the situation you were in when God called you. It's kind of like be content.
Look at verse 32. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided attention to the Lord. That's the key to what he's writing about here. He wants you to find a way, and he thinks if you're single, it's a lot easier to put all your devotion to God, to the Lord, rather than saying, well, I would pray more, but Nora needs, right? I'm not blaming you for anything. And I have no plans to get rid of you.
We can testify to that.
Yeah, I wanted to say it before she did. She may have plans for me. He goes on in 36, if anyone thinks that he's not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry, it's not a sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and is determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. Since then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. And in 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet, in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. The Western line of thought, like I said, is that we want to gravitate toward all the scriptures that support marriage. And that's our kind of our thrust. And I know from working with the singles here, you know, it's hard for them. At least Marie, you can vouch for this. It's hard to be single in this society when everybody else is is married around you. And Nora told me I shouldn't tell this because it's not out of the Bible, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Historically, there are stories, especially in the history of India, that the Apostle Thomas went to India. And this is a passed down oral history in India. There may be some truth to it. There may be some variations to it. I'm not telling you that this is the gospel. But it's said that Thomas, when he went to India, picked up on the celibacy part of this, and he preached celibacy to the people of India. Side note, it apparently didn't do a whole lot of good because
Yeah.
it's the largest population in the world. But what he did was he studied with the king, and the king's name was Misdaeus, Mistaeus. And he studied with the king, and he studied with his wife and converted them. And it wasn't long before the wife said, I'm going to remain celibate. And the king said, you're what? And long story short, the story is that the king had Thomas put to death. And, but that's what they're saying in the history in India. Can you tell me or give me any examples of other situations where you know of people that have chosen celibacy? Nora can, I know.
I can.
There's a place in New Mexico outside
Oh,
of
yeah,
Taos.
That big thing there, the
Yeah. It's a, what do you call it? With monks and everything.
yeah, monastery, yeah.
And they've chosen not only to be celibate, but to be
Silent, I'm saying.
silent. And they allow one guy to go up to the stand where they sell things that they make, and he's allowed to talk to you to sell those things.
Hmm.
That's okay. But otherwise, they have to be quiet. And,
You know, William, I was thinking of just yesterday, talking to Karen's father,
Hmm.
who lost his wife a year ago or so.
In September.
And his words to us, if you remember, I'm closer to the Lord than I have ever been. And when you were talking about that, I couldn't help but think of him being single now, and that's what he's thinking about.
Randy,
When my son-in-law was a singles minister in Tennessee, they had a breakfast one morning and he asked an elder to pray for the group, and the elder prayed his prayer. Lord, help all these poor lonely single people to find a spouse, and, you know, stuff like that. So after he finished, one of the girls said, could I say something? She said, first of all, I'm not poor. I have plenty of money. And second of all, I'm single because I've chosen to be single. You know, and went on to talk about some of the things we're talking about. So, and of course, they figured that out, and the elder said, I've learned something today. I didn't really understand that. So yeah, still happens. That was 20 years ago, but yeah, still happens today.
and we've been talking about mores, you know, things that are part of the culture that go without being said. What, I guess, since it was God inspired, it may have been delivered, but what it turned out happening was that Paul was granting unprecedented freedom to the women of Rome, or Corinth, the Roman women. Now, the Roman women were brought up to actually know that by puberty, they were going to be married. It was just a thing that was expected of them. But also at the same time, And you know this from letters that were written to other churches. The men were either drawn to or a part of worshiping in temples that were devoted to sex. And they were drawing those sexual ideas in. And the men were, I think how to say this, they were brought up, they were indoctrinated. It was just part of their life for them to say, I'm just expected to commit adultery. It was part of their culture. And so what Paul's saying to the people in Corinth is shaking up those Roman citizens in particular, but the citizens who were living under that same era, that same time. And so he was commanding them, or not commanding, telling them that they needed to remain faithful to their wives, limit that sexual activity. And that went against everything that was in that culture. And it was real easy. I know there are countries all over the world where religiously being celibate is something that is held up to a higher standard. And there's a lot of cultures where that's an important part of how they see their relationship with themselves and God. And like I said, here in the Western culture, we tend to automatically move to, I don't have to give you all the scriptures in the Bible that talk about marriage, but we tend to think marriage is the thing. And what Paul was saying is, okay, you can get married, that's good, but understand that you're going to be torn. And that's going to lessen probably your devotion to God. Whereas if you're single, you can devote more time and energy to that. And so that's one of the, I didn't want to get too far into the sex thing tonight. So let's move on to money. A 19th century biographer of George Washington said this: in a land like this, which heaven has blessed above all lands, why is any man hungry or thirsty or naked or in prison? Why, but through his unpardonable sloth? And that was a kind of a Western culture thought. I don't know what the definition of wealthy is. We're all wealthy on different levels. Do we like it when really wealthy people receive special treatment and or look down on us as riffraff? I mean, we've been in restaurants before. We know these people came in and somebody went, oh, and they got to go ahead of us. And you go, you get indignant. And so we have this fight with wealth. We don't like it, but how many of us want to have a better life? How many of us want to strive for the good life, which means we need to get more money? So we don't like it when somebody else has the money, but that doesn't stop us from wanting the money. I'm going to make this statement. We often actually equate, and I'm basing it on this verse that we heard, we equate being wealthy as something morally questionable. In fact, we attribute poverty as being something immoral. There's immorality in poverty. If you want to, you can turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10. only one verse. It says, "For even when we were with you, we would give you this command. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." Yeah, we'll come back to that in a minute. Here in the West, we tend to say it like this: if a man can't eat, it's because he won't work. How many times have you driven past a guy on the corner and said, he's either a druggie, he's an alcoholic, he's a whatever, he's too lazy to get a job. I drive around and see help wanted signs everywhere. Why doesn't he get a job? And we talk about what he's doing. The fact that he can't eat is his fault. And that's different, is it not, than if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. There has to be are you willing to work? But there's a lot of people that work and are still poverty stricken. There are people that work that don't have enough money to live on. And so that's a different attitude. We've taken that one statement and we've kind of turned it to make poverty a negative thing. That's the fault of the person who's poor. In Psalm 52:7, I'm just going to read these rather than having page through these. In Psalm 52:7, it says, "Why do you boast of evil? The righteous will see and fear. They will mock the evildoer, saying, look at the man who did not make God his refuge, but trusted in abundance of his wealth and strengthened himself by destruction." I'm going to read that over again so you can listen if you have it. Look at the man who did not make God his refuge. Now, but he trusted in the abundance of his wealth and strengthened himself by destruction. What do you think that destruction is? Where it says he strengthened himself by destruction.
He
Greed.
lost his family, and I think about J. Paul Getty because my dad worked in Getty Oil, and he was very, very wealthy, but in that process lost his family, had no friends, spent tons of money in his will so that it would always have the name Getty, and it's now Texaco.
Oh.
And there's another side to that as well. You're right. But think of it this way. There's a limited amount of money pie. And if I shouldn't be talking about pie, I'm supposed to be on a diet. Yeah, there's if I take a much bigger pie piece, that means that somebody else doesn't get that piece. I'm destroying others in order for me to get my bigger pie and my bigger piece after that and the bigger piece after that. And in Eastern cultures, in other cultures, and I've heard this story. I have to confess, I have never been on a mission trip to Mexico. My daughter went on plenty of them. We know people, Santiago is gone, all kinds of other people, and you working with the Church of Mexico. The people in Mexico, from what I have seen, if we go down there, they'll put on a spread, and they don't have the money to put on the spread. They will give of themselves because the wealth is not the important thing. What's the important thing to you? I mean, you can tell me.
The fellowship.
The fellowship. They're thinking of the others and hospitality. And there's another part, we're going to get into this later. There's another section where we talk about the difference between shame and not being shameful. But we tend to think that, I want to read this. In our Western mind, this man demonstrated his wickedness in two ways. One, he trusted in his wealth. And we know we're not supposed to do that. Even if you have a lot of money, you're not, that's not going to be the thing that's going to save you. It's not your salvation. And he destroyed others. Now, the psalmist, and this is where I'm going to reiterate this. They read it, it's called a thing called synonymous parallelism, where there's two clauses. He trusted in his wealth and he destroyed others. And they look at it as his hoarding of the wealth was destroying other people. And that's what I said earlier. And we don't tend to look at it that way. If I asked you to analyze that statement, you wouldn't have thought that what he was doing was destructive to others by garnering all that wealth.
So you're saying that's an absolute?
Well, it's not, I mean,
I'm trying to reconcile this in my mind. And, I'm trying to sit there and think of the 5 talent, 2 talent, 3 talent guy, 10, 5, 1, whatever. And somebody there is being rewarded for being a 10 talent or 5 talent individual. Okay? They can do a lot of good with that. In fact, he took the one away and gave it to them. Okay? So there is a place for someone that has wealth beyond others. Okay.
to
So
do something with it.
if he does something, yeah, I mean, I think, how many dollars are there in heaven? There's not any. It's a thing of this life. Okay. So, I'm trying to catch all your points right here, but there is nothing, in my opinion, wrong if you are in service to the Lord. And one of the ways you're in service to the Lord is through economic means.
I'm going to draw a distinction
Okay.
between you and people that are not Christians, who have not studied the Bible.
Mhm.
You know, you've put all the pieces together and said,
I put all
Right, yeah, I'm just saying.
You're way too much credit.
Okay, you put the two pieces together. You know that wealth in and of itself is not bad. And it's not condemned. What's condemned is when you're taking that wealth, and what the psalmist said
It's
was,
no different than what it says in the test. The love of it is condemned.
if you're taking the money and you're doing it in such a way that it harms others,
Absolutely, I agree with
then
that.
that's wrong.
I agree with
And that's the parallel. They're saying he did this and he did this at the same time. They were connected. And
that. But he
that's
trusted in the wealth. That's his first mistake.
exactly.
Well, it's like, it reminds me of all the stories you hear about when you climb in the ladder, how many people you step on going up the ladder. You hurt people as you, for those who aren't careful.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. I was always down.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
I heard a story about a California school superintendent who he knew he was getting near to the end of his time as being the superintendent. He was getting older. He might have been
50.
50. In my case, 75. But he gave up his entire salary for 5 years. He just said, next 5 years, I'm working here. I don't want 1 cent. make that money do something else for the system. Do we hear, how often do we hear stories like that? Don't hear many of them.
Did he do it in the light of day or not? If he did it to be seen of men, he did it for the wrong reason.
No, the story said he did.
Okay.
It wasn't a thing. I'm going to announce on KCBD.
Yeah. I'm
Will
taking
be
it.
Pharisees will bang everything. Look at that.
No, that's not what he did. Now we're going to talk a little bit about modesty. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. Anybody want to read? I didn't read them all.
But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head.
There's a lot more, obviously, in that chapter and associated with all that. I always try to read people's faces when, and for some reason, Nora's smiling at me. She's saying, "Where are you going with this?"
No.
No? Okay. Usually, if a minister in the pulpit or elders or whoever pulls out this particular verses or starts talking about what women should wear, what are they almost always talking about?
What do you say? Modesty. Modesty.
Modesty. What kind of modesty?
How they dress.
Yeah.
Sexual.
Yeah, sure.
Cover yourself up. Why are you wearing shorts in the church? Because people are seeing your ankles, and that's a turn on. You know, we don't. That's usually what we talk about. The respectable Roman women of the time, the culture was an event like that, a church gathering was a public event, and the Roman women would cover their heads. Here's why. We alluded to this last week. People tend to show off their wealth or show off what they are. Last week I mentioned that the Puritans would pay for to sit in the front row. And the poor people had to wait until they all paraded in and sat at their rows, and then they got to see whatever was left. Today we do it a little bit different. We do things like cool in the parking lot with our fancy cars, or we wear only the special shirts that are handmade, I don't know. We have different ways of showing the wealth. What they were doing was turning the church service into almost what was like a dinner party. And they were adorning themselves with jewels and all kinds of baubles in their hair that the poorer people couldn't do. And so his dealing with their dress had to do more with their wealth than it did with it wasn't sexual modesty. Their hair was not the sexual thing. But we have a tendency to turn that into that. They had dinners, Romans had dinners called convivia. You can look that up. basically, it was a wine party that was known for other immoral activities. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he deals with some of that. They were co-opting a godly thing, the church service, and turning it into, taking it away from its focus on God and turning it into like a dinner party and making the focus of being about themselves. And we tend to take that scripture and make it only be sexual rather than having to do with any kind of wealth based on what they were, how they were dressed. I don't know. Any comments, disagreements?
I guess I always just thought this section was more about respect than anything else. That when you go in and openly flaunt, like you're saying, it was just, that's what decent women, or that's what you did if you wanted to. So I mean, I always just thought it was disrespectful during in that culture for women to go in without something on their heads. When Corey moved to Minnesota, he was trying to find a church, and he went to this little Church of Christ there, and every woman in there had something on her head, and they talked about that, and he said, "Okay," and he looked around somewhere. But I mean, he thought, "Okay, we've got a lot of." His first thought was legalism on that.
It's how you interpret it.
Yeah, sure.
If you want to look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. And I want women to be modest in their appearance. They should wear decent and appropriate clothing and not draw attention to themselves by the way they fix their hair or by wearing gold or pearls or expensive clothes." I'm giving you different versions. The English Standard is likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. And we tend to pick up on the modesty thing and ignore all the gold and the pearls and the jewels and the special braiding of hair and all that other kind of stuff. And that was the symbol of what they were doing to flaunt their wealth.
So yes, they were flaunting their wealth, but part of the purpose for flaunting their wealth is because many of those women you alluded to or talked about earlier were from that culture. So when they came to a time together with believers, those women who came in who had become believers had not witnessed men who were believers before. The kind of men they had witnessed was what you spoke of earlier. So when they came to church and they met those kind of men, they wanted those men.
Yeah.
So for the purpose of getting those men, and the reason they dressed the way they did, they braided their hair, they wore every piece of jewelry that they'd ever owned. And they came to church to put down the other women who weren't dressed that way, couldn't dress that way, and they wanted their husbands. That's part of where this is coming from. So it's much bigger than which I think what you're talking, it's much bigger than what we just read in the text. Because if you don't understand that culture, you can't understand what it means.
And that same principle of the wealth and the destruction was the same thing. They were doing what they were doing in order to not allow those who couldn't afford it to do something.
Right.
I'm going to touch on this. If you travel to other countries, you know that you probably ran across things that you were offered to eat. One of the book that I'm using for basis on this, the minister went to the Near East, and the people had laid out a meal, and he had missionary type people who came to visit, and he looked at what was on the table, and he made notice because he knew what the Westerners ate and what the people that were hosting the party ate. And he looked and he just kind of went to each one of them and said, that's your best choice. And so most everybody went and ate that, only to find out later that it was dog.
Oh, wonder what else.
But
That
the
was
thing,
the
but
best
the thing, is, maybe you've been there. I mean, you know what I'm saying? There's food that's placed at. We may have even done this at church dinners. I don't know. Went up and down, went and said, that's going to be my best choice.
Yeah.
You know? So you have that kind of thing. I can't stand to eat Oriental food because I watched how a lot of it was prepared when I was overseas. And I watched people take big rice beetles and break their back in half and then dig out the insides and slap it into some soup that they were mixing. And I was going, no, that's a no. Now, speaking of all this, you know the story of Peter and the thing that was put out before him by God with all the food.
Mm.
Why did he respond the way he did?
Because he been taught his whole life that that food was unclean and he couldn't eat it. It was like a conscience thing.
It wasn't that he was better and couldn't.
I always believed it. Just he said, I've never done that. I've always been taught that you can't eat that food.
But the things were edible. And God was saying, these are edible. Now, what if the sheep came down here and God spoke to us and it had cockroaches, puppies, kittens, chicken.
I want to ignore the picture.
Not eating chickens.
I think I have a couple more minutes for you. If you want to, you look at Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 9, and it's a story of Jesus and his men. They were passing through the grain fields of the Sabbath and they ate. And then it goes on in verse 6. He entered the synagogue and was teaching, and there was a man whose right hand was withered, and he healed him. And if you read all that, and you pay attention to the history, who he's talking to, and everything else, the thing that's mentioned in there 6 times is the word Sabbath. It had nothing to do with his healing. It had nothing to do with the fact that they were eating. The whole point was he was doing it on the Sabbath. And that the issue wasn't eating or healing. So we tend to look at some of these stories and not know what the history was. Or I'm talking to a pretty well-read biblical audience here. And so when we talk about the Pharisees or the Sadducees, or we talk about these characters and some of the Roman stuff you may be aware of or not have ever heard before. So you may say, I understand why the Pharisees, why the scribes, why the Jewish people were in fact reacting the way they were. But there's a lot of people who are reading the Bible and they're starting from bad places because of their Western thought. One last example. We had a girl who came to church, and we were asked if we would, Nora was asked if she would study with her. And the girl was gay. And Nora sat down with her to study with her. And I was back in the bedroom. And it was just gonna be the two women talking. And what did she say? Where does she want to start?
Leviticus.
Leviticus. And we're saying, of all the books in the Bible,
Kidding,
and all
no
the-
kidding.
why did she want to start with Leviticus? It was because somewhere she heard about all the different laws, and some of the laws were things that we wouldn't tolerate now, but it was a law that was against what she was doing. And she wanted to try and understand, how can you have all these laws where killing's okay, but what I'm doing is not okay? And that's her mindset. She came to it from a Western or cultural, or even maybe even geographical place where that's what was thrown up in her face. And that's how she was going to approach the Bible. And that Western cultural mindset threw her off on that study. And we never did get to really finish the study with her. Of course, and that was when you.
I said, just a minute. Bill.
I don't know Leviticus, let me get my.
She said, "Will you?"
And you probably did say that.
Probably.
So I was just trying to make some quick points about all that. Next week, we're going to be talking about race and ethnicity. I had hoped we could get to it this week, but, and the importance of it. Because I know you know a lot of the stories. So I appreciate it. I'm sure the bell rang.
Yeah, you can't hear it down here.
We can't hear it. So I appreciate it all.
Thank you.
Yep.
We put you on